At 2:17 in the morning, in the basement of a $9 million lakefront estate in Chicago, the most powerful man in the city stopped dead at the bottom of the stairs. Somebody was crying down there. He'd come down expecting an intruder. What he found was a young woman sitting on the concrete floor, and she was talking to her own hands. "Move," she whispered. "Please, just once." Her fingers were shaking, and she couldn't make them stop. She tried to curl them into her palms, and they wouldn't close. The skin around her nails had peeled away in pale, ragged strips. Her knuckles were swollen and red, and straight across both palms ran deep, open splits, taped shut with clear packing tape, because she couldn't afford anything better. These weren't the hands of a 28-year-old woman. These were the hands of somebody who'd been working herself into the ground, quietly, alone, for a long time, and nobody had noticed. Camillo Marchetti was 38, and he ran everything north of the Chicago River. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. Grown men learned to go quiet when he went quiet. He hadn't flinched at anything in 11 years. But when he knelt down and took Joanna Callahan's hands in his own, his hands started to tremble too, and he couldn't stop them either. He asked her one question. "Who did this to you?" And she looked back at him, calm, almost apologetic, like she was sorry for the trouble. "Nobody," she said. "I did it myself." He wasn't ready for what came next. If this story moves you, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. Now, let's head down to that basement in Chicago. He didn't answer right away. In that silence, the only things still moving were the tips of her fingers, trembling in brief waves before going still again, as though they too were waiting for him to say something. He was still kneeling there, still holding both of her hands in his, when he realized that he didn't know what to call her. It wasn't that he'd forgotten. He had never known. 11 people worked in this house. He paid every one of them, approved every expense. And yet at 2:17 in the morning, he couldn't say the name of the woman sitting in front of him. The thought came slowly, cleanly, and it cut deeper into him than anything he'd encountered in 11 years. She understood his silence in the only way someone in her position could understand it. She pulled both hands away, hid them behind her back, and sprang to her feet so quickly that she nearly slipped on the concrete floor. She stammered an apology. She said she hadn't meant to be here, that she'd finished cleaning upstairs at 9 o'clock, that she'd only come down to get her things, that she would leave right now. She said she really needed this job. She said it 3 times, each time in a different way, and not once did she raise her eyes. He listened to her beg him not to fire her, inside his own house, at 2 in the morning, with both hands hidden behind her back, because she was afraid they might cost her her job. Camillo Marchetti had given orders to many people in his life. He had ordered a man to disappear from the city. He had ordered a name erased from the books. He had never once given an order to make someone stay. He spoke no louder than the heater humming inside the wall. "Sit down." She sat, not because she wanted to, but because in this house, people didn't ask questions after he spoke. She perched on the edge of the last stair, both hands pressed tightly against her thighs, her back straight, her shoulders drawn inward, the posture of someone accustomed to taking up as little space as possible. He stood, stepped back half a pace, and realized that he wasn't looking directly at her face. He looked at the floor. He looked at the stair. He looked at the patch of wall behind her shoulder. This was a man who had sat across from people who wanted him dead without blinking, and now he couldn't keep his eyes on the face of a woman who had just begged him not to fire her. He asked how long she'd worked there. She said 14 months. He asked again, more slowly. 14 months, sir. Since September of last year. He gave the smallest nod. 14 months meant she'd been inside this house through 2 winters, through 4 occasions when he'd entertained guests in the grand dining room, through countless mornings when he'd walked along the second-floor hallway while someone was cleaning the stairs behind him. 14 months meant she'd washed his clothes, changed his bed linens, wiped away the coffee stains he'd left on his desk, and he had never once stopped. He asked her name. She answered so softly that the heater inside the wall came on at the same moment, and he couldn't hear her clearly. He stood there for a beat, then asked again. Not impatiently, not sharply, he simply asked again. She looked up for exactly 1 second, then lowered her eyes, and this time she spoke louder. "Joanna, sir. Joanna Callahan." He repeated the name silently in his head twice, the way a person repeats an address he should have known by heart long ago. Then he asked a question he himself didn't understand why he was asking. He asked why, in 14 months, he had never seen her. The question came out sounding almost like an accusation, and he heard it the instant it left his mouth. But Joanna didn't understand it that way. She understood it as a question about whether she'd done her job properly. In a calm voice, almost proud of how faithfully she'd followed instructions. She told him it was the rule. She said the housekeeper had explained it carefully on her very first day. Staff weren't allowed to use the main hallway when the owner was present. They weren't allowed to remain in a room if the owner entered. They weren't allowed to speak first. And they weren't allowed to look the owner directly in the face. She said she had followed those rules exactly for 14 months, and then added, as though to reassure him, that she had never broken them once. Camilo stood perfectly still. No one in his organization dared lie to him, so he knew she was telling the truth. And that truth meant that for 14 months, every time he entered a room, this woman had stepped out of his sight with practiced discipline, exactly as she'd been taught, exactly as he had paid someone to teach her. He hadn't needed to deliberately ignore her. An entire set of rules had done it for him. He looked at the way she was sitting, both hands turned down against her thighs to hide what he'd just seen, and he asked the next question, the one he should have asked 14 months ago. He asked what she'd done to leave her hands in that condition. Joanna didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved toward the staircase, toward the upper floor, where a light was still burning in some window, and he saw her make a rapid calculation in her head, the kind of calculation made by someone trying to decide how much the truth might cost. Then she slipped a hand into the pocket of her apron. She took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges worn soft from being opened and folded again so many times, and set it down on the stair between them instead of placing it directly in his hand. He picked it up. It was a pay stub, but not from this house. The employer listed at the top was an industrial laundry in Cicero. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You're here during the day." "Yes, sir. From 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening." "Then what's this?" "The night shift, sir. 5 hours a night, 6 nights a week. I've been doing this specific shift for 11 months, and other night jobs before that for 3 years. He stayed silent long enough for her to think she needed to explain more. She told him the laundry handled linens for hotels and hospitals, sheets, towels, gowns, several tons every night. And her job was to sort the dirty laundry before it went into the machines, then pull the wet loads out of the industrial washers, then fold everything. He asked whether they gave her gloves. "Yes, sir." He asked why she didn't use them. She went quiet. He didn't repeat the question. He simply waited. And after a few seconds, she said the gloves weren't free. Each pair cost $3.50, deducted directly from her pay, and one pair lasted about 4 nights. She gave the number quickly, almost apologetically, as though she were afraid he might think she was complaining. He looked down at the pay stub again. On the line for gross income over 2 weeks, the amount was $2,314. On the deductions line, it was $2,180. On the last line, the net pay, it was $134. He read those 3 lines again in order. Then he asked what the deductions were for. "A loan, sir." "A loan from whom?" "I don't know." He looked up. She wasn't being evasive. She said it exactly as she understood it. "They gave me papers. I signed them. After that, the money started coming out automatically through payroll. I don't have to do anything. Do you have a copy of the contract?" She shook her head. "They said they'd send it in the mail." "Did they?" "No, sir." "Did you call and ask?" "Yes, many times. They said the paperwork was still being processed." He asked how long she'd been making payments. 3 years. He asked how much was left. She said the last time she asked, they told her she still owed $71,000. He folded the paper carefully along its old creases, slowly, then asked one more question, his voice no different than before. "Then what do you live on?" She looked at him as though that question was harder than all the ones before it. Then she said the money from here, the money from this house, was the money that got deducted. The laundry money was paid separately in cash, about $2,600 a month, and because it didn't go through the same payroll system, no one touched it. He asked how much she'd managed to save in 3 years. "Nothing, sir. Not a dollar." "Why?" "Because my mother's in a hospital." "Where?" "Evanston." "How much a month?" $6,200. He said nothing. She took his silence for doubt, so she hurried to explain that insurance covered most of it, that her share was $2,400, every month, always due on the 5th, and in 36 months she had never been late once. She said that last part with something in her voice he couldn't name at first, and it took him a moment to realize what it was. Pride. This woman was sitting on the basement stairs of his house, with hands that could no longer close properly. And the thing she was proud of was that she had never missed a payment. He asked who looked after her mother. "The people at the hospital, sir." He asked how often she visited. "Sundays. That's the only day I don't work the night shift." He asked when she slept. She looked down. "On the bus, sir. It takes 40 minutes from Cicero back here. I get about half an hour, Sometimes there's a little time between duties in the afternoon, and I sit in the storage room." He wanted to keep asking, but he stopped, because he realized that every question forced her to confess something no one should ever have to confess, and she was answering all of it with the obedience of someone who believed she was being inspected. He looked at the pay stub in his hand. $134 for 2 weeks of work, in a house worth $9 million. He said nothing about the number. He didn't comment, didn't make a promise, didn't show anger, because he knew that if even a trace of it reached his face, she would think she'd caused trouble and would stop talking. He simply opened his coat, folded the paper once more, and slipped it into his breast pocket. "That's mine, sir," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I know. I need to keep it for a few days." She hesitated, then nodded, because in this house people didn't ask questions after he spoke. He looked at his watch. It was nearly 3 a.m. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number he only called when someone was about to die. Helena Brandt arrived 40 minutes later, while it was still dark and the entire house was asleep. She came down to the basement carrying a black leather bag, looked Camilo over from head to toe to make sure he wasn't the one who was hurt, then turned to Joanna and asked no further questions. She pulled a plastic chair closer to the stairs, sat down across from her, and spoke in the voice of someone who had done this too many times to need any preamble. "Give me your hands." Joanna looked at Camilo. He nodded. She held them out slowly, palms facing upward, and Mrs. Brandt took one wrist between 2 fingers, with the kind of gentle grip people use only when they already know exactly where it will hurt to touch. She said nothing for nearly a minute. She peeled away the clear tape little by little, stopping each time so Joanna could breathe. She turned her wrist to the left, then to the right. She told her to try straightening her index finger. It wouldn't straighten all the way. She told her to try closing her fingers. They wouldn't close. She asked where the numbness was, and Joanna pointed to the tips of 3 fingers on her right hand, then said she hadn't been able to feel anything there since around June. Mrs. Brandt looked up at her. "June." "Yes, ma'am." "And you've still been working?" "Yes, ma'am." She lowered Joanna's hand, opened her bag, took out a bottle of cleansing solution and several pieces of gauze, then began to speak without looking at anyone, her voice even, as though she were reading from a report. She said both hands had severe tenosynovitis, on both sides, caused by repeating the same motions for too many hours every day, for far too long. She said the numbness in the fingertips was nerve damage, and that the almost certain cause was months of direct exposure to industrial cleaning solvents without protection. She stopped there and didn't use another medical term. She simply straightened her back and said she had examined workplace injuries for 22 years, at construction sites, packing plants, cold storage warehouses, and she had seen every kind of ruined hand there was to see. These were the hands of someone doing the work of 3 people. Then she turned to Camilo. "And this is your house?" Camilo didn't answer. He stood against the wall behind them with both arms hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on the patch of concrete floor in front of his shoes. Mrs. Brandt was the only person left in this city who still dared speak to him that way, and she dared because she had been bandaging him since before he was anyone at all. She didn't add another word. She turned back to Joanna, began washing both of her palms with the solution, and while she worked, she asked how many loads of wet laundry Joanna pulled from the machines each night. Joanna said she didn't count. Mrs. Brandt asked for an estimate. Joanna thought for a moment, then said probably around 40. Mrs. Brandt's hands stopped for exactly 1 beat before continuing. Then she said the most important thing, and she said it calmly, the way someone might announce a train schedule. She said that if Joanna stopped now, completely stopped, not cut back, but stopped altogether, then over the course of about 6 to 9 months, with splints, medication, and physical therapy, her hands could return to almost normal. She said she would be able to grip things, close her fingers, fasten the buttons on a shirt. Then she gave her the second part. If she kept going, even for just a few more weeks, the nerves that were already damaged would stop recovering, and whatever function she lost would be gone permanently. She looked Joanna directly in the eyes when she said it, and she didn't lower her voice to make the truth easier to bear. Joanna listened to every word. She didn't cry, didn't ask her to repeat herself, didn't ask for a clearer explanation. She only sat there in silence, and the first thing she said afterward wasn't about her hands. She asked how long she would have to stop working. Mrs. Brandt said at least 6 months. Joanna shook her head very slightly, almost to herself. "I can't stop working." Mrs. Brandt asked why, and this time Joanna answered without hiding anything. Because the doctor had asked in the voice of someone who wouldn't go reporting her to anyone. She said her mother was in a nursing facility in Evanston, and the cost was $6,200 a month. She said she had applied for state medical assistance twice. The first time she was denied because a proof of income document was missing, even though she had sent it, and they said they never received it. The second time she was denied because she filed 3 days after the deadline printed in the letter, even though the letter hadn't reached her until after that deadline had already passed. She said she called them back. She said she called many times, and every time she was transferred to another number. She said insurance currently covered most of the cost, leaving her responsible for $2,400 a month. And if there was ever a month when she couldn't pay it, they would move her mother somewhere else. When she finished that last sentence, she raised her eyes to Mrs. Brandt, then looked toward where Camilo was standing, and added that she was very sorry for bothering everyone at this hour. Mrs. Brandt set the roll of bandage down. She looked at Camilo. Camilo was still staring at the floor. He spoke without lifting his head. You stop working tonight, both jobs. Your wages will still be paid in full. I'll pay double, starting today and continuing until Mrs. Brandt says you're allowed to work again. In this house, when he finished a sentence like that, the matter was considered settled. Mrs. Brandt gathered the roll of bandage and stood, thinking her part was finished. But Joanna didn't say yes. She sat quietly for a few seconds, then asked where he would pay the money. Camilo looked up. She repeated the question more slowly, as though she was afraid he hadn't understood. Where will you pay it? Through payroll. Where else? He said. Joanna nodded, and there was no gratitude in that nod, only the weariness of someone who had already traveled this road to the end. She said then the money would be deducted. He asked how much. She said almost all of it. She said it happened every month, because they deducted a percentage rather than a fixed amount. So the more she earned, the more they took. She said the year before, the laundry had given her overtime for 3 straight weeks, and she had been so happy because she thought she might finally be able to save a little. But at the end of the month, she took home $11 less than she had the month before. She said, if you pay me double, they swallow double. If you pay me 10 times as much, they swallow 10 times as much. The debt never gets smaller, because what she pays only covers the interest and all the new fees that appear every month, and she had been paying for 3 years. Yet the final balance was still higher than the amount she had borrowed in the beginning. She didn't say any of it bitterly. She simply stated it the way someone might state a fact about the weather. Then she looked directly at him, for the first time since he had come downstairs, and broke the very rule she had just said she had never violated once. She said, you can't save me by giving me more money. If you want to save me, you have to kill that debt. Mrs. Brandt stopped halfway through standing, the bag still in her hand. Camilo said nothing. He had listened to thousands of people beg in his lifetime, and he realized that in the past 2 hours, this woman had not asked him for a single thing. He spoke, his voice lower than before. Then let me take care of that part. You stop working. I'll give you the money directly, in cash. Joanna shook her head at once. No, sir. He asked why not, and she answered with a sentence he would remember for a very long time after that night. She said, I don't need your pity. I need you to pay me exactly what I earned. She said she had cleaned this house for 14 months. She knew she cleaned it well. She knew she arrived on time, and she had never missed a single day, not even when she had a fever of 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. She said that in those 14 months, no one had ever told her she was doing a good job, and she didn't need anyone to. But if you give me money now because you've just seen my hands, then I'll become something different in this house, and I don't want to become that. I came into this house through my work. I want to leave it through my work. Camilo Marchetti stood perfectly still for a long time. In 11 years, no one had spoken to him this way. People negotiated with him, flattered him, threatened him, bargained with him, but no one had ever refused him because of their own self-respect. He looked at her, and this time he held his gaze on her face, and he managed to say only one thing. All right. He said she would keep her same position and her same salary, not 1 cent more. But starting tonight, she was not to touch any work until Mrs. Brandt gave her permission. He said the rest was his problem, and he offered no further explanation. Joanna watched him for a moment, searching for a trap hidden somewhere inside those words, then nodded. Mrs. Brandt fitted temporary splints to both of her hands, told her not to wash dishes, not to wring out towels, and not to carry anything heavier than a glass of water, then went upstairs. Camilo told her to go to her room and rest. She asked what time she should come down tomorrow. He said there was no time. She looked at him as though that was the hardest sentence to understand all night, then climbed the stairs slowly, holding both hands away from her body. Left alone in the basement, Camilo took the pay stub from his breast pocket, unfolded it, and looked once more at those 3 lines of numbers. Then he called Marta Beckwith. The housekeeper answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and already carrying fear. He asked her about the personnel file for a maid named Joanna Callahan. Who hired her? Who approved her? Who signed off on it? The other end of the line stayed silent long enough for him to know he was about to hear something he didn't want to hear. Then Marta said, very softly, that she hadn't hired her. Mr. Renner brought her in. He didn't ask Marta another question. He ended the call, remained in the basement until daylight, and at 7 o'clock sent a single line to 12 people. 9 o'clock, grand dining room, everyone. In the 11 years he had been in charge, he had sent that kind of message exactly 4 times, and all 4 had meant war. By 10 minutes to 9, 12 cars filled the drive. They entered the grand dining room with the look of men who had already called their families on the way there, and no one sat down before he did. Gabriel Orsini arrived first and stood at the head of the table, both scarred hands resting on the back of a chair. Silas Renner arrived near the end, took the same seat he had occupied for 15 years, to Camilo's right, and nodded to him as he did every other morning. Camilo didn't sit. He stood at the head of the room, waited until the door was closed, then told the man nearest it to ask Miss Callahan to come downstairs. Someone in the room quietly asked who Callahan was. No one could answer. Joanna came down 3 minutes later. She stopped at the threshold, both hands still in splints, wearing the same work clothes because she had nothing else, and stared directly at the floor out of the habit she had practiced for 14 months. Camilo told her to walk to the middle of the room. She did. 12 men seated around the long table watched her, none of them understanding what was happening. And in that moment she looked so small she almost disappeared inside the room. Camilo didn't introduce her, didn't explain, didn't offer a single word of preamble. He said only 3 words. Show them. Joanna hesitated. Then she lifted both hands away from her body, turned her palms upward, and held them up for the entire room to see. No one said anything. It wasn't the silence of men who were shocked. It was the silence of men who understood too well. The men sitting in that room hadn't been born with cars and watches. One had once worked the furnaces on the south side. Another had unloaded cargo at the docks when he was 16. Another had spent 10 years welding before he was brought into the organization. Every one of them knew what hands ruined by labor looked like, and every one of them knew what it took to ruin them that way, and how long it took. They looked at those 2 hands, and read every month in them, the way a man reads the rings in the trunk of a felled tree. The man at the far end of the table turned his face away. Another set down his coffee without drinking it. Gabriel Orsini stood motionless for a long time, then pulled out his chair and sat, bent forward, and covered his face with his own hands. In 20 years, no one in the organization had ever seen Gabe lose control. Not even the night they carried his younger brother out of a warehouse in Bridgeport. He sat like that without making a sound, and no one dared look toward him. Camilo let the silence remain long enough. Then he spoke, without raising his voice, and without emphasizing a single word. In my house, 14 months, none of you knew her name. He paused. Neither did I. No one answered. He went on to say that his mother had cleaned other people's houses in Pilsen for 19 years before she married his father, and he said only that one sentence, and stopped. He didn't lecture them further, because he knew no one in that room needed a lecture. He said Miss Callahan worked 2 shifts, here, and at a laundry in Cicero. He said her pay every 2 weeks, after deductions, was $134. He said the number and offered no comment, and it sat in the middle of the room like something that had just been placed on the table. Someone asked what the deductions were for. Camilo said that was exactly what he was going to find out. He told Joanna she could go upstairs, and she left. And when she passed the end of the table, Gabe stood and opened the door for her. He said nothing. He simply stood there until she was out of the room. Only after the door closed did Camilo sit in his chair. He said that starting today, he wanted to know the name of every person working in this house, who hired them, who paid them, and everywhere the money passed before it reached their hands. He said he wanted the complete personnel files within 24 hours, and he wanted Tobias Fenn there that afternoon. No one asked why. For the rest of the morning, Camilo didn't look to his right even once. Silas Renner sat silently in his usual place, both hands resting on the tabletop, and he didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask who the girl was. He didn't ask why the meeting had been called. He only gave one nod when Camilo finished speaking, the same approving nod he had given him for 15 years, then lifted his coffee cup and drank it empty. Mrs. Brandt returned at 4 o'clock that afternoon to replace the temporary splints with proper ones. This time she worked in the small sitting room beside the kitchen instead of the basement, while Camilo sat some distance away in the chair by the window, holding the personnel file in his hands without having opened a single page. She removed the temporary splints from the night before, checked each finger joint again, then stopped at Joanna's left wrist. There was a narrow strip of cloth wrapped around it 3 times and tied neatly in place, and it wasn't anything Mrs. Brandt had put there the night before. She asked what it was. Joanna said it was to support the tendon, ma'am. Mrs. Brandt asked who had told her to wrap it that way. Joanna said no one had. She had done it herself, and had been doing it for a long time. Mrs. Brandt said it was wrapped in the wrong place, that it wasn't supporting any tendon at all, and that tightening it like that every day would only interfere with her circulation. She told Joanna to let her take it off. Joanna instinctively raised her other hand to protect her wrist, then realized what she had done, and lowered it again. Mrs. Brandt untied the knot and unwound the cloth 1 turn at a time. Beneath it was skin that had never seen sunlight, paler than the rest of her arm, and on that skin was a small tattoo, a sparrow, done with a needle and ink, the lines uneven, darker in some places and lighter in others, the kind of tattoo someone made themselves rather than had done in a shop. It had faded badly over the years, the blue ink gone gray, but the shape was still clear, both wings folded in, its head tilted slightly to one side. Camilo had been looking down at the file in his hands. He looked up because Mrs. Brandt had gone silent for a little too long. He saw the tattoo, and for the first 2 seconds he didn't understand why his chest had suddenly tightened. He had seen thousands of tattoos in his life, but he couldn't take his eyes off this one, and he didn't know why, and then he did. 11 years earlier, a parking lot in the South Loop, 2 o'clock in the morning. He was 27 years old, lying flat on his back on the concrete between 2 rows of cars, and he knew exactly how fast he was bleeding because he had watched it happen to other men. He remembered thinking that this was the end, thinking it with a strange kind of calm. Then someone came running. He never saw the face, only a shadow dropping beside him, and then a weight pressed hard against the wound, hard enough that he almost screamed. 2 hands stayed there. They didn't ease up once. He remembered trying to say something, and no sound coming out. He remembered someone counting out loud, a young voice trembling violently, counting to keep herself from running away. And he remembered the only thing he could see clearly that night, the thing directly in front of his eyes because that hand was pressed against his chest, a small bird tattoo on the wrist. When he woke 3 days later, they told him an unidentified person had called for an ambulance and left before it arrived. No name, no message. No one had seen the person's face clearly. He had searched for her. For 11 years, he had searched. But he searched in the only way he knew how, which meant asking inside his own world, asking lenders, runners, people who slept on the streets and sold information to survive, putting a price on anyone who could bring him a woman with a bird tattoo on her left wrist. It had never occurred to him to place an ad in a newspaper, because in his line of work, people didn't place ads in newspapers. For 11 years, that message had circulated only through the underworld and had never once reached an ordinary person. Camilo stood up. The personnel file slid from his knees and fell to the floor, and he didn't pick it up. Mrs. Brandt looked up at him in surprise, then pushed her chair back. He walked over, dropped to one knee in front of Joanna, and he didn't ask permission. He took her left wrist, turned it toward the light from the window. Her entire body went rigid. He studied the tattoo for a long time, closely and slowly, the way someone examines a signature on a document they signed many years ago. Then he asked, and his voice no longer sounded like his own, 11 years ago, were you in the South Loop? Joanna didn't answer, but the hand in his began to tremble, and this time it wasn't because of the tendons. He asked again, the parking lot behind the warehouse on Wabash Street. October. Was that you? She looked at him, and he saw her recognize him, later than he had recognized her. But she did recognize him, and the look on her face wasn't relief. It was fear. She pulled her hand away and said, very softly, that she thought that man had died. Mrs. Brandt understood that she should no longer be in the room. She picked up her bag and left, closing the door behind her. Camilo was still kneeling. He didn't stand. This was a man who had never knelt before anyone in his life, not before his father, not at his mother's funeral, and now he was kneeling on the wooden floor of his own sitting room, before a woman whose name he hadn't even known until the night before. He said thank you. He said you kept me alive. He said for 11 years I looked for you. I offered money to anyone who could find you. I asked all over this city, and then he stopped, because he realized what the next sentence was going to be. Joanna wasn't moved. She looked down at him, and there were no tears on her face, only something slowly rising inside her that she had held down for too long to contain anymore. She said, so now I have value. She said it very softly. Then she went on, and her voice began to tremble, not from fear. She said, "I've been in this house for 14 months. I clean the stairs you walk down every morning. I wash your shirts. I press myself against the wall when you pass, because I was taught that's what I'm supposed to do. For all 14 of those months, I was still this same woman, with these same hands, and you never asked me my name." She said, "Now that you know what I once did for you, I'm finally worth kneeling for." What about the last 14 months? When I was only the woman who cleaned your house, how much was I worth then? The question fell between them, and neither one reached down to pick it up. Camilo didn't defend himself. He didn't say he was busy, that the house was too large, that it was the housekeeper's responsibility. He raised his head, looked directly into her eyes, and said nothing. He said, "That's my fault, not anyone else's in this house. Mine." Joanna turned her face away. She let out a breath very slowly, and when she spoke again, the anger had settled, leaving only exhaustion behind. She said she hadn't meant to hide it from him. She said she truly believed the man that night had died because there had been so much blood, because by the time she heard the ambulance siren, he had stopped responding. Then she told him the story. For the first time in 11 years, the first time she had ever told anyone. She said she had been 17 then. She said she had just had a fight with her mother, a terrible one, had shouted things she would spend the rest of her life wishing she could take back, and then she ran away from home. She said she slept at the bus station for 2 nights, then started sleeping in parking lots because security guards kept forcing her out of the station. That night, she had been lying behind a truck between 2 rows of cars when she heard voices. She said she looked out. Several men were standing about 65 feet away. She couldn't see the man who pulled the trigger clearly, because his back was turned, but she saw the man who gave the order. He was standing beneath a streetlight, in no hurry at all, and he pointed twice. She said she remembered a ring on his left hand, square-faced and heavy, the kind of ring that caught the light and flashed. She said when it was over and they headed back to their car, he was the last one to leave, and he walked with a limp, his right leg dragging more than his left. She said she remembered, because at the time she had thought that if she had to run, she could outrun him. She went on to say that only after their car drove away did she crawl out. She said she hadn't intended to save anyone. She had only meant to run, but when she passed by, the man was still conscious and looking at her. She said she couldn't remember what she had been thinking. She only remembered dropping to her knees and pressing both hands over the wound, because she had seen people do that on television. She said she called an ambulance from a payphone on the corner and then ran. And she ran because she was certain that if those men learned a teenage girl had seen their faces, she wouldn't survive the week. She said she didn't dare go to the police, didn't dare tell anyone, not even her mother when she returned home 3 weeks later. She said she had kept silent for 11 years, and in all those 11 years she had never once heard that anyone was looking for her. She said if she had known, maybe she would have come looking for him. Maybe. Camilo listened to every word without interrupting once. When she mentioned the square-faced ring, he didn't move. When she mentioned the right leg, he didn't move then either. He remained seated on the floor, both hands resting on his knees, and inside his mind a face had appeared with brutal clarity, a face he had seen that very morning at the breakfast table, sitting to his right, finishing his cup of coffee. He said nothing. He only asked whether she was certain she remembered correctly. Joanna said she wished she didn't. Tobias Fenn arrived at 7 o'clock that evening, 3 hours later than promised, and he came carrying 2 boxes of documents instead of a single file. He set them down on Camilo's desk, took off his coat, then said he'd had people reviewing everything since that afternoon, and wanted to say one thing before they began. He didn't like what they had found. He placed Joanna's pay stub on the desk, the same sheet Camilo had given him at noon, then laid another document beside it. He said the deductions from Miss Callahan's paycheck all flowed to one place, a company called Halcyon Credit Solutions. Camilo looked at the name and said nothing. Fenn continued. Halcyon was a consumer lending company licensed to operate in Illinois, properly registered, fully current on its taxes, with nothing unusual on paper. It sat among the family's legitimate businesses. Then Fenn opened the second file and pushed it across the desk. He said Miss Callahan's original loan had been $18,000, taken out 3 years and 2 months earlier, and the stated purpose in the file was long-term care expenses for a family member. He said that as of the most recent reconciliation, the remaining balance was $71,400. Camilo asked how. Fenn said 3 years of late fees, compounded interest on those fees, and something called a processing charge that was assessed again every quarter. He said he wasn't going to explain the details because the details weren't what mattered. What mattered was that the debt had been designed so it could never be paid off. Then he pulled out another sheet of paper and said this was the part he needed Camilo to hear carefully. He said federal law limited wage garnishment to 1/4 of disposable earnings. Halcyon was taking 94%. He said they managed it through a clause buried in the stack of papers borrowers signed at the beginning, called a voluntary wage assignment, written in a way no ordinary person could read and understand, and it allowed the money to be taken directly through payroll before the worker ever saw a dollar of it. Fenn said this wasn't a civil dispute. This was a crime. Camilo asked how many people. Fenn didn't answer immediately. He opened the first box and turned it toward him. He said 412. He said that was the number as of now, and he hadn't finished reviewing the earlier years. Camilo pulled the box toward himself. He took out the file on top and opened it. A 51-year-old woman who worked the night cleaning shift in an office building in the Loop. She had borrowed $9,000 to repair her roof. She still owed $38,000. He set that file down and opened the next one. A 60-year-old man who worked at a laundry, who had borrowed $4,800 to pay for his wife's funeral. He still owed $22,000. He opened the next file, then another. Fenn sat down in the chair across from him and said nothing for nearly an hour. Outside, darkness had settled completely. Camilo read every file, skipping none of them, and he read slowly, stopping at the occupation listed for each person. Laundry worker, night cleaner, hotel room attendant, dishwasher, cold storage loader. Every one of them was the kind of job people did after dark, after everyone else had gone home. Every one of them was the kind of job where the worker never saw the face of the person paying them. Somewhere around the several dozenth file, he stopped and sat still for a long time, both hands resting on the desk. Then Fenn opened the second box and took out a much thinner set of papers, its edges yellowed with age. He placed it in front of Camilo and opened it directly to the final page. He said Halcyon had been included in the restructuring portfolio that year, grouped together with 11 other legitimate businesses. He pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. He said, "You signed this 9 years ago." Camilo looked at his own signature. He remembered that afternoon. He remembered someone placing a stack of papers in front of him and saying, these were clean businesses. Nothing he needed to concern himself with. They only needed his signature to complete the transfer. He remembered signing the entire stack in about 4 minutes. He said, "I didn't order this." Fenn didn't argue. He said, "No, you didn't order it." Then he said the next sentence in the voice of a man who had represented this family for 30 years and had learned that sometimes only the bare truth was useful. "You just didn't ask." Camilo didn't answer. He sat there between the 2 boxes of documents and thought about the woman sleeping upstairs with both hands in splints. The woman who had pressed her hands against his wound in a parking lot 11 years earlier, and for the past 3 years, once every 2 weeks, a stream of money had traveled from her payroll into a company carrying his name. He asked Fenn, who was running Halcyon. Fenn said every operating signature from the past 4 years belonged to one person. Then he said the man's name. He did nothing with that name for the next 4 days. He told Fenn to keep digging, told him to keep it quiet, and mentioned it to no one. During those 4 days, the house began moving to a new rhythm that no one named aloud. Joanna remained in her old room upstairs. She didn't come down to work in the kitchen, didn't pick up a broom, didn't touch anything. Both hands were locked in rigid splints from the middle of her forearms all the way down over her finger joints, and Mrs. Brandt had instructed her to remove them only twice a day, 15 minutes each time, just enough to move her fingers gently. She wasn't used to doing nothing. On the first day, she woke at 6:30 out of habit, stood in the second-floor hallway for a long while, then went back into her room. On the second day, she tried to button her own shirt and spent 10 minutes on the top 2 buttons before giving up and putting on her outer jacket to hide them. On the third day, she stood in the kitchen for nearly 15 minutes with a bottle of water on the table, trying to find some way to open it without using her fingers. She trapped it against her elbow, braced it against the edge of the table, then finally set it down and drank from the faucet instead. Camilo saw her from the hallway. He didn't go in. He stood there and realized that if he walked in and picked up the bottle to open it for her, she would apologize, and he didn't want to hear her apologize one more time. That evening, he left a box of drinking straws and a lever-style bottle opener on the kitchen table without saying anything and without leaving a note. The next morning, the opener had been used, washed clean, and returned to exactly the same place. During those same 4 days, he learned something he had never before needed to learn. The first time he saw her struggling with her bedroom door, he started to tell her to leave it. "I'll do it." He got the first 3 words out and stopped, because he heard his own voice, the same voice he had always used to tell other people what to do, and he knew she would obey, and he didn't want her to obey. He silently pushed the door open for her and walked away. The second time was on the stairs. when she was carrying a tray, and he knew she was going to drop it. He opened his mouth and again said nothing. The third time came on the afternoon of the fourth day. She was sitting on the back steps with a hair tie caught around the wrist of one splint, trying to gather her hair using only her elbows. She got halfway there and her hair slipped loose. She tried again. It slipped loose again. She sat still for a while, then lowered her head. And Camilo, standing 4 paces away, saw her shoulders tremble once, and then stop. He walked over. He stopped behind her, and this time he managed to say it. "Can I help?" Those 4 words were harder for him than anything else he had said that week. Joanna turned around. She looked at him for several seconds without understanding. Then she did, and she nodded. She held out her wrist so he could take the hair tie. He carefully slipped it off, avoiding the splint. Then he stood behind her and began. He didn't know how. He gathered her hair too high, then too low. He stretched the tie and it slipped from his fingers, falling onto the step. He picked it up. He tried again. This time he managed to gather her hair, but when he tried to loop the tie around it, the whole bundle fell apart. He paused for a beat, then started over. She sat still, saying nothing, not turning around, not giving him instructions. Cars passed out on Lakeview. Wind moved through the trees in the yard. He failed 2 more times. On the 4th try, he held the gathered hair with one hand and worked the tie around it with the other, slowly, twice, then a 3rd time, and tightened it. It wasn't pretty. It sat crooked to one side, and several strands had fallen loose at the nape of her neck, but it held. From the moment he reached out until the moment he lowered his hands, 4 minutes passed, and neither of them spoke a word. He stepped back. Joanna lifted an elbow and lightly touched the gathered hair to check it, then lowered her arm again. She still didn't turn to look at him. She sat facing the yard and asked him a question. She asked why he was doing these things. She said she didn't mean the hair. She meant the bottle opener, the doctor, calling 12 men to the house just to look at my hands, making me stop working while still paying me. She said, "I know you're doing something downstairs in the study. People have been coming and going for days. There are boxes full of papers." She said, "I'm not asking what you're doing. I'm asking why." Camilo stood behind her and couldn't answer. He couldn't say, "Because I owe you," because she had already rejected that answer days before. He couldn't say, "Because I feel guilty," because that would turn her into something he was using to redeem himself. And he couldn't tell her the truth. The truth he had been avoiding every time it rose in his mind over the past few days. That he was trying to repair something he himself had signed his name to 9 years earlier. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know yet," and he went back inside the house. On Sunday, he told her he would drive her up to Evanston. Joanna said she could take the bus. He said, "I know." She looked at him, then picked up her coat. During the 40-minute drive, she spoke only twice, once to point out a turn, and once to remind him that Sunday afternoons were usually crowded, so it would be better to park in the back. She sat with her back straight, both splinted hands resting neatly on her lap, and looked out through the window. When they arrived, she led him in through a side entrance, signed the visitor log by gripping the pen between her palms, and the woman at the desk greeted her by name, the way someone greets a face they have known for a long time. Mrs. Eileen's room was at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway. The door was already open. She was sitting in a chair beside the window, a thin blanket over her legs, her hair falling over one shoulder. Joanna stopped at the threshold for exactly 1 second, then stepped inside and said, "Hello, Mom." Mrs. Eileen looked up. She looked at her, smiled brightly, the polite kind of smile reserved for someone you are fond of, and said, "Oh, the nurse is here." Camilo stood in the hallway, close to the doorframe. He saw Joanna's shoulders stiffen, just slightly, for less than half a second. Then she smiled. She said, "Yes, I'm here." She pulled a small chair closer and sat beside her. Mrs. Eileen asked if today was Thursday. Joanna said today is Sunday. She said then there ought to be cake. Joanna said, "I'll ask downstairs in a little while." She asked Joanna how long she had worked there. Joanna said, "I've been here for 3 years." She said, "No wonder you look familiar." Then she said, "You have very beautiful hair." Joanna thanked her. She took the comb from the drawer, and because both hands were still in splints, she had to hold it between her palms to brush Mrs. Eileen's hair, very slowly, one short section at a time, and Mrs. Eileen closed her eyes because it felt good. For the next 20 minutes, Joanna never stepped out of that role once. She asked whether she had slept well the night before. She reminded her to finish the glass of water. She listened to her tell a story about an old neighbor, a story Joanna had heard no fewer than 30 times, and she laughed in exactly the right places. Mrs. Eileen asked whether she had a family. Joanna said, "No, ma'am." She said, "You're still young, don't rush." Then she asked whether Joanna had a daughter, and Joanna said no, I don't have anyone yet. Mrs. Eileen nodded thoughtfully, then said, I have a daughter. Joanna said, yes, ma'am. She said she's a good girl. She works far away. Joanna said yes. She must be very busy. She said yes, very busy, but she'll come back. Joanna nodded and said yes, she'll come back. Then she bent down to retie Mrs. Eileen's shoelace using her elbows, and it took a long time, and while she did it, she never raised her face. When Mrs. Eileen began to grow sleepy, Joanna pulled the blanket higher over her, said, I'm leaving now. I'll come back next week. Then stood and walked out. She left the room, took 4 steps down the hallway, and stopped. She stood there facing the wall, and then she crumpled. There was no loud sobbing. She simply slid down until she was sitting on the hallway floor, and she tried to lift both hands to cover her face, but the splints wouldn't let her bend her arms enough, so she just sat there with her face completely exposed, her shoulders shaking in waves, with nowhere to hide any of it. Camilo walked toward her. He didn't know what to do. He had stood in front of men holding knives. He had sat in rooms where his life was being negotiated, and he had never felt so helpless. He reached out, then lowered his hand. He couldn't put his arms around her because that would be too close. He couldn't pat her shoulder because that would be too little. In the end, he sat down on the floor a short distance away, facing the same direction she was, and rested both hands quietly on his knees. He stayed there until she stopped. No one passed through the hallway. When she had calmed down, she said, I'm sorry. He said, don't. Then he asked her a question, very softly, why she had never asked anyone for help. Joanna wiped her face against the shoulder of her coat. She said, I did. 3 times. She said the first time was a legal aid office on the west side. They took down her information and said they would call her back. The second time was a non-profit organization that specialized in labor issues. They scheduled her for a Tuesday, but she worked the night shift every Tuesday. She asked to change the appointment, and they said they would see what they could do, and then nothing happened. The third time, she called the state complaint hotline. She spoke to someone for 4 minutes before being transferred, and she stayed on hold for 40 minutes until her lunch break ended. She said no one ever called back, not one person. Then, she was silent for a long time, and she added something she had never told anyone in that house. She said she didn't give birth to me. She said she adopted me when I was 7, and the papers were finalized when I was 9, and she chose me when no one else did. She said when I was 17, I left her. She looked down at her splinted hands. Then she said now she doesn't remember me anymore, but I remember. So I pay. Every month, I pay. It happened on Tuesday afternoon. Camilo was in the study with Fen when Silas Renner knocked on the door, then came in without waiting to be invited, exactly as he had done for 15 years. He apologized for interrupting, then placed a cloth bag and a wristwatch on the desk. He said security had just reported a missing watch from the second-floor changing room, and when they checked, they found it in the room belonging to the staff member at the end of the hallway. He said they had also found this in the same place. He opened the bag. Inside was cash, stacked in bundles and bound with rubber bands. He said $9,000. He said he had ordered it counted twice. Camilo didn't touch the bag. He asked who had found it. Renner said one of the security men. Following procedure, he asked who had reported the watch missing. Renner said he would have that checked again. Then he sat in the chair across from Camilo and spoke in the calm, reasonable voice of a man helping him dispose of an inconvenience. He said he understood her circumstances. He said anyone in a situation like hers could become desperate, and he didn't want to make a bigger matter of it than necessary. He suggested handling it quietly. Let her go. Give her an additional 2 months of wages, as a gesture of help. Escort her out of the house without a scene. Don't call the police. Don't put anything in her record. He said that would be the kindest thing for her. Then he said it would also save Camilo the trouble of dealing with all those boxes of documents. Camilo looked at him. Fen sat silently in the corner, his eyes still lowered to the file in his hands, but at some point he had stopped turning the pages. Camilo said, leave it there. Renner asked what he intended to do. Camilo said, I'll look into it. Renner nodded, said it was up to him, then stood and walked out, passing Fen without looking at him. All that evening, Camilo didn't ask Joanna a single question. He didn't have anyone call her downstairs. He didn't mention the watch. He left the cloth bag exactly where it was on the desk and sat staring at it for a long time, because one detail kept catching in his mind, and he couldn't push it away. $9,000. That woman owed $71,000. If she had $9,000 in cash in her hands, she would have paid it toward the debt. Near midnight, there was a knock at the door. Marta Beckwith stood outside holding a folder against her chest, and she remained there for a long time before stepping inside. She was 58 years old, had been the housekeeper in this house for 12 years, and Camilo had never seen her tremble like that. She set the folder on the desk, then said, "I put the money there." Camilo said nothing. She went on, speaking faster now, as though afraid she might lose her courage before she finished. She said that on Monday afternoon, someone from Mr. Renner's office had called her, given her the bag and the watch, and told her to put them in Miss Callahan's room, in the bottom drawer, and not say anything to anyone. She said she had asked why. They told her it was her job and to just do it. She said she had done it. She said she was sorry, and she knew an apology didn't change anything. Camilo asked why she was telling him now. Marta was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Because the other day I saw those hands." She said she had a granddaughter about the same age. Camilo asked if there was anything else, and she said yes, there was more, and that was the real reason she had come downstairs at midnight. She said that in all 14 months Miss Callahan had worked there, Marta had never once paid her wages. Camilo asked, "Then who did?" She said a staffing company handled that part. She said every 2 weeks they sent the payroll paperwork over, and she only signed to acknowledge receipt and forwarded it along. She never opened it because it wasn't her responsibility. She said she didn't know what was written inside. She said she had always assumed it was just paperwork. After saying that, she stood still, and Camilo understood that she had just admitted the worst thing she could have said about herself. He asked the name of the staffing company. Marta said it aloud, and Camilo looked toward Fen, who had remained seated in the corner the entire time. Fen gave one nod. It was on the list. It was also controlled through Mr. Renner's office. Then Marta opened the folder she had brought with her. She said she had spent the afternoon going back through the records. She took out a thin file and placed it in front of him. It was Joanna Callahan's employment contract. Camilo turned through the first page, the second, then the final page, where there were 3 signature boxes. The first contained Joanna's signature, rounded and careful, like a schoolgirl's handwriting. The second was Marta's acknowledgement signature. The third was the box for the referring party. Inside it was the signature of Silas Renner. Camilo looked down at the lower right corner of the page where the date was printed. September 19th, 14 months earlier. The next morning, Camilo called Gabriel Orsini into the study and closed the door. He handed Gabe the employment contract, the pay stub, and the name of the staffing company Marta had given him. He said, "I need to know when this started. Not 14 months ago. Before that, Gabe didn't ask a single question. He was gone for 2 days. On the evening of the second day, he came back with a notebook, sat down, and before opening it, he said one thing. He said, "I hope I got this wrong." Then he began. He said that for 10 years Renner had been quietly searching for her, but 4 years ago, a specific background file was opened at an old branch of the lending division, when he finally tracked down a 24-year-old woman working the night shift at a packing plant in Cicero. There was an identifying detail recorded in that file, and Gabe read the line exactly as it had been written. Bird tattoo, left wrist. He said the request for the search had come from Mr. Renner's office. He said 6 months later, that same woman received a consumer loan offer from Halcyon, addressed directly to her, at exactly the time her adoptive mother had just been moved into a nursing facility. He said the loan was approved within 2 days, a speed no comparable application ever received. He said from that point on, every time she changed jobs, the loan followed her. The packing plant, then the restaurant, then the laundry. Every time, payroll was handled by a staffing company from the same portfolio. He said there wasn't a single place she worked where one of their companies wasn't standing in the middle. Camilo asked why. Gabe turned to the next page and didn't answer immediately. He said for 11 years, you offered money to anyone who could bring you a woman with a bird tattoo on her wrist. He said the word had traveled all over the city, and everyone in the business knew about it. He said if that woman died and someone saw her wrist, you would know within 48 hours, and the man who gave the order would pay for it. Gabe said killing her would have been the same as putting a noose around his own neck, so he didn't kill her. He did something else. He tied her down. Camilo said nothing. Gabe continued reading, his voice even, without emphasis. He said the debt made it impossible for her to leave Chicago because the money was taken directly from her wages, so changing jobs accomplished nothing. He said her mother's care expenses made it impossible for her to stop working, even for a single week. He said put those 2 things together, and she had no time left, no money left, and no strength left to go looking for someone to tell about what happened that night. He said for 4 years she had been living inside a closed circle someone had built around her, and she didn't even know it existed. Then Gabe turned to the final page and stopped. He said there's one more thing. He said in August of last year, a man from the organization, someone who used to work at that old branch, had drinks with Mr. Renner at a bar in Wicker Park. That man no longer worked for the family. Gabe said he had sat with him for nearly 4 hours the night before. He said the man remembered Mr. Renner making a remark that night, saying it like a joke. And the man remembered it because he hadn't understood what it meant at the time. Camilo asked what he said. Gabe looked down at the notebook and read, "The safest place to hide a witness is right under the feet of the man looking for her, because he'll never look down." There was no sound in the study. Camilo sat still. He didn't stand, didn't strike anything, didn't change his expression. He simply sat there with both hands resting on the desk and stared into the empty space in front of him for a long time. Gabe said nothing more. He knew when to be silent. Inside Camilo's mind, everything was fitting together, not like a conspiracy being uncovered, but like a mirror being raised in front of his face. The man hadn't hidden her in another city. He hadn't changed her name. He hadn't locked her away anywhere. He had brought her here, into this very house, put her in a uniform, and let her move through the hallways every day, let her clean the exact staircase Camilo walked down every morning. And he had managed it because he had calculated one single thing with perfect accuracy, without being off by an inch. He knew Camilo Marchetti wouldn't look. Not because Camilo was cruel, not because he was careless, but because in his world, the woman who cleaned the house was part of the house itself, like the stairs and the light fixtures, and people didn't look at the stairs. That failure to look, something he had never considered a flaw, something he had never thought about once in his life, had been turned into a tool. His enemy hadn't needed to outsmart him. He only needed to rely on him. Camilo remained there a little longer. Then he asked Gabe one question, his voice normal, almost gentle. He asked the man who drank coffee that morning, sitting to my right, nodding at me, did he know she was upstairs? Gabe said he's the one who brought her in. He knew every single day. The call came at 10:40 the next morning. Joanna's phone vibrated on the kitchen table, and because she couldn't pick it up, she asked Marta to put it on speaker. The woman at the desk in Evanston was on the other end, her voice hesitant, saying that Mrs. Callahan had been transferred the previous afternoon. Joanna asked where she had been taken. The woman said she wasn't permitted to provide that information. Joanna asked who had transferred her. The woman said a legal guardian had come to complete the paperwork, with all the proper documents and a court order, and the facility had no authority to refuse. Joanna said, "I'm her daughter." There was a pause on the other end. Then the woman said, "I'm very sorry, but according to the file, you aren't her guardian." Camilo had been standing in the kitchen doorway for some time. He picked up the phone, gave his name, and within 3 minutes, he had the case number. He called Tobias Fenn. Fenn needed 40 minutes to obtain a copy of the court file, and when he called back, his voice sounded completely different. He said the guardianship order was real. A judge had signed it. There was a case number. It had been filed 11 months earlier and approved in April of that year. Camilo asked who had filed it. Fenn said Halcyon Credit Solutions, acting as a creditor with a financial interest in the cost of Eileen Callahan's care. Camilo asked how a creditor could legally claim personal guardianship. Fenn said because they slipped a power of attorney and contingent guardianship designation form into her loan agreement 3 years ago. The court was misled into believing her only relative had voluntarily designated them to manage her care upon incapacity. He said the signature on that document was Joanna Callahan's. He said it matched. The handwriting hadn't been forged. It was her real signature, taken from the stack of papers she had signed 3 years earlier. The stack someone had placed in front of her at a counter and told her to sign wherever there was a mark. Fenn said the form was on page 23. Camilo ended the call. He turned around, and Joanna was standing directly behind him. She had heard everything. She said, "I didn't sign that." Then she said it again, louder. "I didn't sign that." And she raised both hands, but the splints kept her from gripping anything. Not the edge of the table, not the front of her own shirt, not the phone slipping from between her palms and falling to the floor. She bent down to pick it up and couldn't. She tried 3 times. On the 3rd attempt, she simply sat down on the kitchen floor beside the phone where it lay. And she didn't cry aloud. She only breathed, fast and shallow, and said she doesn't know where she is. She said she'll ask what day it is and no one will answer her. She said she'll look for the chair by the window. She said she thinks I'm the nurse, but she waits for that nurse every Sunday, and this Sunday I won't be able to come, and she'll sit there waiting. Marta turned her face away. Camilo lowered himself in front of her, one knee touching the floor, and he offered no words of comfort. He said, "Give me 6 hours." Joanna looked up. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was brutally clear. The clarity of someone who had been promised too many things in her life and had learned not to believe anyone anymore. She asked what happens if you can't find her. She wasn't asking to accuse him. She asked because she needed to know what she should prepare herself for. She said, "I've called people many times in my life, And every time they tell me not to worry. She said, I don't need you to tell me not to worry. Camilo looked at her. He had lied to many people over 11 years. He had promised things he never intended to keep, to men he knew wouldn't live long enough to demand them. But he had never promised something he couldn't do, because in his world, a broken promise killed faster than almost anything else. He said, I've never promised something I couldn't do. He said nothing more. He didn't say, I'll find her. Didn't say, don't worry. Didn't say everything will be all right. He stood, picked the phone up from the floor, placed it into her hands, and helped her bring her palms together around it so it wouldn't fall. Then he walked into the hallway, took out his own phone, and called Gabe. He said only one sentence. The old woman from Evanston was moved yesterday afternoon. Find her. He looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 11:20. Gabe didn't go looking for the old woman. He went looking for the bill. He told Camilo over the phone that someone her age, in her condition, couldn't be moved in an ordinary car. There had to be a private medical transport ambulance, 2 technicians, and transfer paperwork. He said there were only 11 companies in the region that provided that kind of service. He said someone had paid for that ride, and money always left a trail. 3 hours later, he called back. He said he had found it. A company in Cicero, a run at 2 o'clock the previous afternoon, pick up in Evanston, drop off at a private long-term care facility in Joliet, about 31 miles southwest of Chicago. He said the invoice had been paid with the corporate card of a company in the portfolio. Camilo asked if she was all right. Gabe said, I had someone go in as a family visitor. Nothing looks wrong. Then he added one more sentence, and his voice changed slightly. He said, she's sitting by the window. They left immediately. During the 40 minutes on the highway, Joanna sat in the back seat with both splinted hands resting on her lap, and she didn't ask a single question. She only looked out the window, and every time the car slowed at a red light, she lifted her eyes toward the clock on the dashboard. The facility in Joliet was a low 2-story building, set behind a broad lawn. The person at the desk asked for documentation. Fenn handed over a copy of the court file along with another paper Camilo didn't look at closely, and 4 minutes later, they were allowed inside. Mrs. Eileen's room was on the first floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled of floor cleaner. The door was open. She was sitting in a chair beside the window, a thin blanket over her legs that someone there had placed around her, and she was looking out across the lawn. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't panicking. She had no idea she had been moved 31 miles away. No idea there was a court order bearing her name. No idea how many people had spent the last 24 hours searching for her. When a shadow fell across the doorway, she turned and asked whether there was apple pie today. Joanna froze at the threshold. Then she went inside, very quickly, dropped to her knees beside the chair, and tried to embrace her with arms that could no longer use their hands. She wrapped both elbows around her mother's shoulders, pressed her face against her, and cried, Mrs. Eileen startled slightly, then raised a hand and patted her back. The polite kind of comforting touch someone gives a grieving stranger. She said, there. She said, don't cry anymore. Joanna couldn't say anything. She only lifted her head, and Mrs. Eileen took Joanna's 2 splinted hands into her own aged hands and held them there. She looked down, and something changed in her face. It was very quick and unmistakably clear. Her eyes were no longer distant. She looked straight into Joanna's face, studying her closely, like someone stepping out of fog and suddenly realizing where she was. She gently squeezed Joanna's hands. Then she said, your hands are so cold, my little sparrow. A sob broke out of Joanna. She collapsed into her mother's lap. Her left wrist, where the strip of cloth had remained off since Mrs. Brandt removed it, was exposed in the window light, and there lay that faded little bird. The tattoo a 17-year-old girl had pricked into her own skin with a needle and ink one night while sleeping on the street, because it was the only thing she still had left of the woman she had just walked away from. Camilo stood in the hallway. He saw the tattoo, understood, and had to turn his face away. Mrs. Eileen remained lucid for a little while longer. She said, you've gotten thin. She asked whether Joanna had been eating. She reached up and touched Joanna's hair, the crooked bundle still tied off to one side from the other day. She said, your hair is tied terribly. Joanna laughed while she was still crying and said, yes, it is. Mrs. Eileen said, let me fix it. Then she reached up to loosen the hair tie, and the instant her fingers touched it, she stopped. She looked down at her own hand. She looked at Joanna. Her eyes began to cloud again, slowly, like fog gathering once more across glass. She released the hair tie. She smiled the same polite smile as before, the smile reserved for someone you feel fond of but can no longer remember. And she said, you have such beautiful hair. She asked whether there was apple pie today. Joanna was still kneeling there. She wiped her face against the shoulder of her coat. Then she said yes. I'll ask downstairs in a little while. 30 seconds. All of it had lasted only 30 seconds. But when Joanna stood and turned toward the door, Camilo saw something on her face that he hadn't seen once in all the days before, and it took him a moment to find the name for it. It wasn't pain. It was the peace of someone who had just been given proof that 3 years of sacrifice had not been meaningless. Mrs. Eileen was taken back to Evanston that same evening, and Fenn stayed in Joliet for another 2 hours to finish the paperwork. The next morning, Camilo summoned the entire council, not the 12 capos from the previous meeting. This time it was everyone, including men who hadn't returned in years, including 2 who had retired long ago but whose names were still in the books. The grand dining room was packed. Silas Renner arrived on time, greeted everyone, and took his seat to Camilo's right, the same chair he had occupied for 15 years. Camilo didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, and he began by placing a file on its surface. He said, "These are the records of Halcyon Credit Solutions for the past 4 years. He pushed it toward the center of the table. Then he placed down a second file. He said, "This is the signed statement of Mrs. Marta Beckwith, the housekeeper of this home, concerning who gave her $9,000 in cash and told her to place it in a staff member's room." He placed down a third file. He said, "This is the employment contract of Miss Joanna Callahan, signed on September 19th of last year, under the box marked referring party." Then he bent down, lifted the cardboard box at his feet, and set it on the table. He didn't open the lid. He said, "Inside this box are 412 files." He said that means 412 people are having 94% of their wages taken every 2 weeks, and every one of them does work that not a single person sitting in this room has to do. No one in the room said anything. Fenn stood and spoke for 4 minutes, concise, adding nothing beyond the figures, and when he reached the part about the voluntary wage assignment and used the words criminal offense, several men turned their heads toward the far end of the table. Renner remained silent throughout. He didn't interrupt. Only after Fenn sat down did he lift his coffee cup, take a sip, set it back down, and smile. It was a faint, tired smile, the kind an older man gives when he is being forced to remain patient with a child. He said, "You're going to tear apart the entire organization over a maid." A chair shifted somewhere in the room. Camilo didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around the room for agreement. He only looked directly at Renner and said, "She kept me alive with those 2 hands. He said you took them away from her." Then he said, "She isn't a maid, Silas. She is the person I owe my entire life to." Renner didn't answer. For the first time that morning, he had no response prepared. Camilo turned toward the door and nodded. The door opened. Joanna walked in. She wore her outer coat, both hands still in splints, and she walked to the middle of the room along the same path she had taken the last time. But this time she didn't look at the floor. She stopped at the opposite end of the table, facing Camilo, and slowly looked around the room from left to right, one face at a time. No one rushed her. She looked past Gabe. She looked past Fenn. She looked past men she had never met before. Then her eyes stopped. She stood motionless for several seconds. After that, she raised one of her splinted hands and pointed. She didn't point at Silas Renner's face. She pointed at his left hand, resting on the tabletop beside his coffee cup, where he wore his ceremonial crest ring, a heavy, square-faced signet he only brought out for formal council meetings, its surface gleaming sharply under the overhead light. Joanna said nothing. She simply kept her arm raised. The entire room was silent, and inside that silence, the man sitting closest to Renner slowly moved his chair farther away. Renner looked down at his own hand. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. He braced one hand on the table to lift himself, and once he was upright, he took a step to the side. His right leg dragged across the floor, 1 beat slower than his left. He took another step. No one in the room was looking at the ring anymore. Every pair of eyes had dropped to his leg. Somewhere near the middle of the table, someone let out a very soft breath. Gabriel Orsini shot to his feet, and his chair toppled backward onto the floor behind him. Renner stopped. He looked at Joanna for a long time, and there was no panic on his face. No denial either. There was only the expression of a man who had just realized that a very old calculation had finally failed after all those years. He managed one sentence. He said, "You saw me." Joanna lowered her hand. She said, "Yes, I saw you." Then she added, in a very calm voice, that for 11 years I thought if I ever spoke, I would die. She said, "It turns out you believed exactly the same thing about yourself." Renner didn't answer. He stood there in a room full of men who had shared a table with him for 15 years, and not one of them stepped forward to stand beside him. Camilo looked at him for a long time, and in that moment, everyone present knew exactly what the laws of the family said was supposed to happen next. Gabriel Orsini was already on his feet, and he didn't sit back down. Two men at the far end of the table stood as well. No one said anything, because in that room nothing needed to be said. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone had seen them enforced before, and everyone was waiting for a single nod from the man standing at the head of the table. Camilo hadn't nodded. He was still standing there, and he hadn't spoken a word since Renner stepped away from his chair. Then footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Joanna walked around the far end of the table and came toward him. She didn't look at Renner again. She stopped in front of Camilo and raised both of her splinted hands, holding them there for him to see, exactly the way she had held them up in this room before. She said these hands once kept a man alive. She said don't turn them into the reason another man has to die. Then she said one last thing, and she said it very softly, only loud enough for him to hear. She said if you do that, then 11 years ago I saved the wrong man. Camilo looked at her for a long time. In the 11 years he had held that position, he had never allowed anyone to change one of his decisions, and everyone in the room knew it. Then he turned to Tobias Fenn and said 2 words. File it. Fenn stood. A murmur spread around the table, the first sound of its kind that morning. Someone said you can't. Someone else said you know what this means, don't you? Camilo answered no one. He said that from this moment forward, Silas Renner held no position, owned no share, and had no access to anything bearing the family name. He said the entire Halcyon file, the ledgers, the guardianship order, and the 412 case files in that box would be turned over to federal prosecutors that day through Mr. Fenn's office. He said 3 charges would be named, and Fenn recited them plainly. Federal wire fraud, organized unlawful wage deductions, and fraud in guardianship proceedings. Renner listened to all of it. He didn't protest, didn't bargain, didn't mention the 15 years he had spent sitting at Camilo's right hand. When 2 men stepped up on either side of him, he only turned his head toward Camilo and said one thing. You just made yourself weaker with your own hands. Camilo said, I know. Then they escorted Renner out of the room. The door closed behind him, and no one in the grand dining room said another word. The price came quickly. Over the next 3 weeks, 4 members of the council withdrew their names. 2 branches on the west side of the city cut off contact. Calls went unanswered. Dinners were left unattended. And in 2 coffee shops along Grand, people began saying that the head of the Marchetti family had handed his own family's business to the federal government because of a maid. Camilo explained himself to no one. He simply finished what remained. Halcyon was dissolved. All 412 debts were erased completely. No negotiation, no gradual reduction, simply gone. Every dollar that had been unlawfully deducted over 4 years was repaid in full to each person. It took 4 months and consumed nearly the entire family reserve fund, and twice Fenn suggested paying in installments, and both times Camilo said pay it all at once. But the hardest part wasn't the money. The hardest part was finding the people. Many of those on the list had moved, changed phone numbers. Some had gone to other states. Some had no permanent address. Gabe took that job himself. He didn't hand it off to anyone, and he didn't leave an envelope and walk away. He went to every home, knocked on every door, waited on every porch, and introduced himself by name. He explained exactly how much money there was, explained exactly why it was being returned, and stayed long enough to hear every question they wanted to ask. Then, before he left, he did the same thing every time. He asked their name, not the name in the file. He asked what they wanted to be called, and he wrote it down in a hardbound notebook he carried in his coat pocket. 4 months, 412 names, written by hand, about 11 lines to a page. Some lines included an occupation. Some included a short sentence. Things like this woman worked the night shift at Mercy Hospital for 19 years, or this man borrowed money to pay for his wife's funeral. When the work was finished, Gabe brought the notebook in and placed it on Camilo's desk. He said I was going to send it back to storage. Camilo said, leave it here. From that day on, the notebook remained at the corner of his desk beside the lamp, and it wasn't there to remind him that he had managed to fix something. He kept it for another reason, one he had never spoken aloud to anyone. 412 people had worked inside his buildings, washed linens for his hotels, cleaned the floors of his offices, for 4 full years. He kept that notebook to remember that there had been 4 years when he hadn't known a single one of their names. 2 weeks after Gabe placed the notebook on his desk, Joanna said she was moving out. She told him one morning on the back steps, in the same place as before. Camilo asked why. She said it wasn't because she was angry. She said that over the past several months, he hadn't done anything that gave her a reason to be angry. Then she said the harder part. She said in this house now, everyone knows who I am. People open doors for me. They pour water for me. They call me Miss Callahan. She said if I stay here now, then for the rest of my life I'll be the girl who saved you, and I'll live on that name until the day I die." She said, "I want another name, not the girl who saved someone, not the maid whose wages were taken from her, a name I earn for myself." Camilo listened to all of it. He could have made her stay. He knew he could, because in this house, once he finished speaking, the matter was considered settled, and he also knew she was waiting to see whether he would do exactly that. He didn't. He only asked what she needed. She said nothing. He asked whether she had somewhere to live. She said she had rented a room near Evanston, closer to her mother, so visiting would be easier. He nodded. Then he said only one thing. He said, 6 months from now, your hands will be healed. He said, I can wait. Joanna looked at him, and she promised nothing, and he didn't ask her to promise anything. She went inside to pack, and by noon she was gone, carrying exactly one bag, the same amount of belongings she had brought into that house 14 months earlier. 7 months later, on an early spring afternoon, she came back. During those 7 months, she had found a job by herself, submitted the application herself, and gone through 3 interviews before she was hired. She worked as a coordinator for a nonprofit organization on the West Side that helped people whose wages had been stolen, whose pay had been unlawfully deducted, who had been pressured into signing stacks of papers they couldn't read. She was the person who answered the phone. She was the person who called back. She had memorized one sentence, and she said it to every person who called. "We'll call you back on Thursday." And every Thursday, she called. That afternoon, she arrived at the mansion on Lakeview without warning. The person who opened the door recognized her immediately. The house was very quiet. She walked through the hallway, past the foot of the stairs, and heard water running in the kitchen. Camilo was standing there with his back to the door, washing a cup beneath the faucet. He didn't hear her come in. Afternoon sunlight poured through the kitchen window, spreading across the floor, across his shoulders. She walked up behind him. She reached out. She placed her hand over his. Then she closed her fingers. They closed. They closed completely around his fingers, firm and warm. There were still scars on her skin. There were still faint white lines crossing her palms, much lighter now but not entirely gone, and perhaps they would never disappear completely, but her hands could close. Camilo stood perfectly still. He didn't turn around right away. He looked down at the hand holding his. Joanna said, "I can close my hand now." He lowered his head. He bowed over those 2 hands. And the man who had not cried in front of anyone for 11 years began to cry. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She simply kept her hand where it was and let him cry until there was nothing left to hold back. Outside the window was the quiet afternoon, and inside that house, for the first time, no one had to press themselves against a wall when someone else walked past. This story leaves us with a few things worth carrying with us. The first is that people don't disappear because they go far away. They disappear because no one looks at them. There are people who pass through our lives every day, cleaning, serving, repairing, driving us where we need to go, and we have never once asked their names. Not because we are cruel, but simply because we have grown accustomed to not looking. The second is that a person's dignity doesn't depend on what that person has done for us. Joanna deserved to be treated with kindness during all 14 months, when she was only the woman who cleaned the house, not only from the moment people learned that she had once saved a life. The same is true for everyone. A person's worth is not something they should ever have to prove before they are allowed to have it. The third is that real strength does not lie in having the power to punish someone. It lies in having the courage to admit that you were wrong, and being willing to pay the price for that wrong, even when the price is very high. And finally, please don't forget that sometimes the greatest kindness is simply to stop, look another person in the eyes, and ask their name. If today's story touched you, please leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, is there someone who works around you day after day whose name you have never asked? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.